Hi there, John. Are you able to introduce yourself to the viewers, please?
Sure. My name's John Hart. I'm the Green Party candidate for Wairarapa.
Excellent. So I'm just going to put some questions to you, John. Obviously, you contested in 2014. So what is sort of different about this time as compared to last time? Like, what are you sort of doing differently this time to sort of, try and get that push towards making it into government?
Right, good question. I guess this time I knew what I was getting into, so maybe that was, for better or worse, I should have thought about it, but I knew exactly what I was doing this time. I think the big difference for me is that we've had a lot of, I've had a lot of recognition and awareness of who I am between the campaigns. I have not just some guy that turns up once every 3 years. I've stayed pretty active in the community and a lot more people know me now. That comes through in the feedback that a lot more people are saying, oh, you're that guy. So we're getting used to people knowing who I am.
Excellent. And you're also quite active as far as the fabrication laboratory goes.
Yeah. So the Fab Lab's a project that I helped set up almost 2 years ago now to teach our local kids about digital manufacturing, and it's also been helping our community groups and our businesses to do innovation as well. And that's something I'm really excited about, is how we diversify our economy locally and how we foster innovation right here in Wairarapa.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been sort of a bit of back and forth in the news about sort of the Labour-Green relationship, like who's going to be working with who. How's it sort of going to be looking? Like, what are you sort of like hoping is going to happen? Are Greens prepared to work closely with Labour? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah, so there are only two parties that have committed to changing the government, and that's Labour and the Greens. So, from our point of view, it's a nice match, and we've obviously got the memorandum of understanding with Labour, which means we are working together to change the government. But after that point, everything else is up for coalition negotiation. So it's going to depend in a big way on the numbers on the night. So I guess I'd say voters have a choice if they want a Labour-led new government, who their partner is going to be, whether it's New Zealand First or the Greens. And if you want to see those green policies on climate change, on inequality, on clean water, getting a really strong sort of supporter and a lot of follow-through in a Labour-led government, and that's, Party Vote Green is the way to make sure that Labour has that support partner.
As far as like the rural sector goes here in the Wairarapa, how do you sort of appeal to farmers? Obviously, you've got sectors here in the Wairarapa that are very traditionally national voters. So how do you, as Green Party candidates, sort of like appeal to those people to try and get those people on side?
I think our challenge is to show farmers that we actually have the same values as them, and I don't know any farmers that want to pollute the waterways or leave their farms in a way that's worse for their kids to inherit. So, we all actually share those same values, and it's just maybe we disagree about how fast we need to move to the end solution, and that's the key for us, is having that conversation. But, the farmers I talk to, they mostly get it, and they actually do understand that we're all going in the same direction.
Excellent. And tell us a bit about sort of Greens' rural policies. How can sort of Greens really sort of boost the agricultural sector, the primary industry sector? Right.
Well, for us, our vision for agriculture is where we actually have really high value exports that are not getting us away from our dependence on the commodity markets in the world. Those markets do expose us to a lot of risk, whether it's new products coming in like synthetic protein, whether it's changing dietary habits, like a lot of countries and people are moving away from meat consumption, or just global markets that go up and down. The dairy price is a classic example of you've got a commodity that's quite unstable sometimes, and you're trying to invest for the long term and build a business when your key income is up and down every year, and that's a challenge for farmers. So what we want to see is an agricultural industry that has much more certainty. It lives up to the story that we tell the world, and rather than selling a commodity product, whether it's meat or milk or fibre, we actually aim at the absolute top of the market, and we capture those consumers who are going to pay the most for the best in the world. And that it's not just a good business strategy for our farmers, it's also a great response to climate change and to lessen our impact on the environment as well.
And what ways is the Green Party planning to clean up the rivers in New Zealand, and especially here in Wairarapa? If you were to be voted into Parliament, if you had a seat in Parliament, what would you be advocating for in the way for cleaning up our rivers here in the Wairarapa.
Right. Well, the first thing I would do is I'd look really closely at the current plans for the large-scale irrigation and water storage. There's only one way you can pay for expensive water, and that's to increase production. And that may mean increasing stock densities or changing land use from one that's less intensive to one that's more intensive.
Right.
So we're going to see an inevitable intensification of agriculture in the region if we go ahead with that irrigation project. So one thing I'd love to see is flipping that question around and saying, well, rather than irrigating maybe 3% of the region to boost GDP on those farms, it's probably 100 to 150 farms max. What about if we look at the other 97% of the region and actually find better ways for farmers to grow new crops and best practice so that we can actually lift production on all farms and then focus on lower intensity agriculture and ideally more niche agriculture that is actually suited to the landscape and gives our growers more chances to sell into niche markets overseas where they'll pay more for the best products.
Cool, that's really awesome. As far as what sort of reports have quoted that there is you need more sort of agricultural production in order to make the water scheme work?
Well, I mean, it's a truism that when you take a farm that's not paying for water now and you sell it water at maybe 20, 30 cents a cubic metre, whatever it's going to be, you've got to pay for that somehow. So you can't just magically add water to an existing business model without paying for it somehow. So almost inevitably, farming land use changes when there's irrigation available. And it may be something like lamb fattening where you do more of the same and make more money. But experience shows us around the country that you do get conversions to dairy from dry stock, and that's an inevitable part of the process. The challenge is how much of that becomes dairy in the region. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is, you look at the state of the lakes at the bottom of the catchment, and it's not putting blame on urban or rural, but those lakes are not in a great state. If we're adding more cows and more intensive agriculture to our valley, what happens to those lakes? I think the answer is pretty obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. Where does Green sort of stand on 1080, the use of 1080 in the region?
That's a good question. So I guess you'd say we were reluctantly in favour of using it.
Okay.
If we could wave a magic wand and not need to use 1080 tomorrow, we'd love to do that. But right now, the science and the organisations that are doing the work are telling us that it's the only viable tool we have in the short term, and it buys us some time to find other solutions. I don't think you'd say the Greens are pro 1080, but we acknowledge that it's the only tool we've got for large-scale pest control right now. But we'd love to have an alternative.
What would you say is an alternative that you'd love to see?
Well, some of the trapping technologies are looking really cool. So things like Good Nature have got self-resetting traps. They've still got to be checked and maintained occasionally, but they're much better bang for your buck in terms of people labour. So there's that. There are other poisons and other chemicals coming along as well that may be more or less environmentally friendly. So there are options, but we do need a much bigger investment into pest-free or predator-free NZ, as the sort of movement's called, to have a future for our native wildlife.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Greens policies on climate change. What would that sort of look like here in the Wairarapa if these policies were to come to fruition? What would that look like?
Well, I guess to give you context, we need as a country to play our part on climate change. So we need things like a carbon tax to actually put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously in the past that hasn't included agriculture, so there's a bit of a pathway to bringing agriculture into a scheme like that. So there would be some costs on one side of the ledger for farms accounting for their emissions, but on the other side of the ledger you also would have certainty around carbon credits. So things like farm forestry or riparian planting or retiring unproductive chunks of farmland back into forest or native bush, those would get credits as well. So a lot of farmers that are already doing what we'd call the good stuff would actually be kind of almost revenue neutral anyway, because they're effectively doing the things that will mitigate the emissions from their stock anyway.
All right, and I guess where do you sort of stand on water levies? So just what Labor is proposing.
So the green policy is we agree in that we want to put a levy on bottled water that's being exported. I think not many people would disagree that if someone's taking water for almost nothing and selling it overseas, that they should be paying for that. and that money should go back into things like river cleanup or helping iwi with water management. The wider issue of commercial pricing for water, we agree in principle that there should be a conversation around that, and we should figure out what a fair price should be, because we want to drive efficiency as well. But we haven't set a price as Labor has. So our plan is to have a working group after the election that brings in iwi, farmers, urban people, all the stakeholders, and basically figures out a really fair way of what we want to achieve, how we pay for that, and who bears responsibility for water management.
Excellent. And let's switch to sort of the topic to health. As you probably know, there's been 606 suicides in 2016 to 17. Here in Wairarapa, we have the highest rate of suicide per head of population. If you were to get into Parliament, if you were to be get a seat at Parliament, or to be representing Wairarapa as a list or as an MP, what would sort of be the things that you would want to do to try and advocate for decreased numbers of suicides and more support for people with mental illness?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's a really important question for our region. As you say, we've got the worst rate in the country. So mental health and rural mental health are things that I'm quite passionate about.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem is simply funding. Our DHB is underfunded for those services, and we've got groups like King Street Artwork who do amazing work in the community, and they're a drop-in point and a first point of call for a lot of people. But that's kind of all we've got. There needs to be much more of that resource in the community. The Greens have a policy of actually bringing in free counselling for young people. Now it's a start, and we're hoping it's the beginning of a movement that takes it through to everyone that needs it. But I mean, ultimately, we should have a healthy society where everyone can get the help they need when they need it. But primarily, it comes back to proper funding of support services and the DHBs. Yeah,
absolutely. What would you want to see happen in terms of rural mental health? Like, how can we reduce suicides in the farming community?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. Now, I don't propose that I'm an expert on mental health. I'm passionate about seeing it improve. And what I would do is look for the organisations that are already working in that space and ask them, what do you need to do more? How can we support you, and what does the evidence tell us about how we actually work towards this? And just setting a goal for a start. You're just saying, let's set a goal of 0 suicides and work towards that, rather than kind of wringing our hands and saying, I wish we could do better. I think that's one of the main failings of this government, is they haven't actually said, we're going to set a goal and we're going to work towards it with everybody involved.
And that's something I actually did read about, that the Green Party were actually committed to a goal of 0 suicides. By which date was it?
Good question. I can't remember the exact date, but it wasn't that far away. And I think even if you don't get there, it's really important to have a goal and just start working towards it.
And you would commit to that as part of the Green Party?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, cool. As far as sort of like the economy in the region goes, what would the Green Party do, and yourself, if you were to be elected into Parliament, what would the Green Party do to to support our low wage earners? Because the Wairarapa is traditionally a low wage economy, so what would we do to support those living on minimum wage with families to support?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, obviously the minimum wage needs to go up, and we have this weird thing where we have a living wage that we accept as what people need to live on, and that's to pay your bills and feed your family and everything else. And then below that we have the minimum wage, and we're okay with paying this minimum wage, which is somehow, we all know, is less than what people need. And so you can understand why people struggle when 1 in 5 of the kids in poverty are living in families that are working families. So there's something fundamentally wrong when people just aren't getting paid enough money. And there'll be people that say, oh, well, you can't afford to put that cost on businesses. But my response to that is, well, every business in Wairarapa pretty much survives because of their customers, and their customers having money to spend. So if we can increase the minimum wage at a little bit faster rate than has been happening in the last sort of 9 or so years, that's going to have a sort of a starting point. And the Greens have committed to increasing the minimum wage to 2/3 of the average wage by, I think it's 2025. So it's pretty quickly ramping it up, so it gets to a living wage level pretty soon. The other thing we would do, of course, is those people that aren't in work need support too. And so we would increase all benefits by 20%, which would basically get them sort of back to where they were when they were first cut in the 90s. So it's not even radical, it's just putting them back to where they should be. But that should support a lot more families out of poverty who are having real trouble making ends meet right now.
Some people would argue that raising the benefits would encourage people to stay on benefits. What would you say to that?
I don't buy into that at all. I mean, people either want to work or they don't. Now, at the moment, the system we've got absolutely punishes someone for trying to get off a benefit by taking part-time work. The minute you start earning $80 a week, you get pummeled for it. So if you think of a job, as soon as you have more than a couple of hours of work a week, you're suddenly over the limit. It makes no sense. If you want to help people get out of dependency on benefits, then make it easy for them to get some part-time work if that's what they want to do. But fundamentally, we have a duty to care for people in the society, and if people need help, we should give them help. It's really as simple as that.
Sure. And what would also the Green Party do to show in the Wairarapa? There's a lot of people who are starting their own business, who are making opportunities for themselves. What would the Green Party do to support those people?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think about specific policies on small business. We would love to see a flourishing local economy, and we have things like procurement policies. We want government to buy local. We want to encourage local businesses wherever we can. So I think there's a range of sort of tax incentives and even for example, our climate change policy. It would put a tax on emissions, but it gives people opportunities to get credit back. So things like forestry planting or small businesses in Manuka honey or reforestation. There's lots of opportunities, and we've got the plans to plant more than 1 billion trees to start getting progress towards our climate change goals. That's going to create a huge number of jobs and opportunities in the rural sector because that's where the land is. We're going to plant the trees. So, I think under a Green Labour government, you'd see a lot of interesting opportunities for people to start making their own way in small business. And
what about opportunities for young people? How does what plans does the Green Party have to sort of say bring back apprenticeships and help young people sort of make their way in society, get on the ladder of that first job?
Yeah, well, we absolutely support getting more students into apprenticeships. I think it's vital for the future of, especially regions like Wairarapa. There was a period where everybody was told you have to go to university, and there are a lot of students who, for them, university is not the right place. They want to learn a trade or they want to do something different, and it's really important that we have both the skills coming through for the economy that we need, but also that people get to fulfill their potential. And if your potential is being a tradesperson and you want to go and learn that trade, then we should support young people into that. It's nuts that in Christchurch we've got this building boom, but we're importing tens of thousands of foreign workers to work on construction sites because we just don't have the capacity to train our young people. So that's something we really need to look at hard.
When I spoke with Mr. Scott, the current MP sort of about apprenticeships, I think his sort of view was that there are a lot of opportunities currently in the Wairarapa because of the current construction boom. Like, say from sort of Featherston to Waipawa, there is definitely lots of houses springing up. Would you say that's this is sufficient for young people? Like, are there opportunities there if young people want?
I don't think you can't just leave it up to the market and say, well, there's demand, so therefore builders will take on apprentices. You've got to put in place the infrastructure, you've got to support the training organisations to ramp it up. They won't just magically create more apprentices just because there's a building boom on. The easiest path for most builders is to hire people out of the region who have the skills. And so that's not directly helping young people. And it's only a national party that would say, well, the housing crisis is a wonderful business opportunity. I mean, we should be desperately building houses because it's the right thing to do, not because it's a market failure.
And that's what I was actually going to ask next, was what's the Green's response to the housing crisis? How do you plan to solve this problem in the Wairarapa? What would you do to advocate for, for there to be more houses built here?
Well, fundamentally, if you haven't got enough houses, you need to build more houses. Like, it's a pretty obvious solution. And you can't leave that up to market forces. That just isn't working. And we've had a government that's been selling off state houses as fast as they can. So they've actually made the problem worse. And now they're buying motels to house people as some sort of temporary measure. So the whole system is backwards. We should be looking at building more houses as fast as possible. So the Green Party policy is to build 5,000 more social houses. That would be in conjunction with social housing providers like Trust House in Wairarapa. I mean, it's amazing that we have not a single state house in Wairarapa. They're all owned by private providers.
Yep.
And that has been good, and that they've been good providers of that housing and those services, but they haven't had the capital and the ability to build more to keep up with demand. And so as you find houses dropping out of the rental pool in Wairarapa, they're not being replaced by social housing or purpose-built rental housing. And so you've got families who are desperate to find better houses that can't. You've got people who are out of housing and living in cars and in motels because we just don't physically have enough houses for people.
And that's what I was also going to ask, was what will the Green Party do to support the renters here in the Wairarapa who are being sort of forced out of the market because houses are being snapped up and bought by those first-time buyers, those buyers coming from Wellington to try and get a cheaper deal. How can these people be supported? I mean, are there there's no way putting rent control in place or or discouraging the sale of rental properties?
Yeah, well, one of our policies is actually to give tenants more security and tenure in their rental. So we want to acknowledge that for probably half of New Zealanders now, renting is their only option because they can't afford to get in the housing market. So you've got to have a little more of the power tilted back towards renters so that they actually have some security where they are and they're treated fairly when they are in housing. So that combined with our warrant of fitness for rental houses will mean that they're going to get a house that's much more of a standard that is like one you'd buy rather than just a scummy rental.
And there's lots of those. So oppositions to the WOF housing is that it would cost, and the cost would be reflected back on tenants. What do you say to that?
Well, that's a line that's put out by landlords and their associations who say that the world's going to end if we have to have any more costs. But I mean, fundamentally, if you're providing a house for someone as a business, a home for someone as a business, you have an obligation to make sure that it's fit for purpose. If I rented you a car and it didn't have a warrant and you crashed and injured yourself, I'd be in terrible trouble. So when we've got houses that are making our kids sick, so that they're missing school and then their entire life is being affected by this these long-term health outcomes, it just seems immoral that we allow people to rent houses that are unfit for purpose. And if your house is cold and damp and not fit for living in, then we've got to fix that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have the room in the Wairarapa to build more houses?
I'm looking out at the window at some pretty big paddocks. Yeah, we've got tons of room. I mean, there's always that tension. You don't want to build over all the good food-producing land. But, I mean, Wairarapa, of all places, we have more room than probably anywhere in the country to build more houses if we need to.
Excellent. Did you make a submission to the Local Government Commission on amalgamation, and where do you stand on that?
Yeah, so I was not convinced that the costs of amalgamation would be outweighed by the benefits. So I actually submitted against amalgamation on that basis. I can still be convinced, but to date I haven't yet seen an argument. Now the one thing I like about amalgamation as a possibility is that we would present a united front to the rest of the country and the rest of the world.
Yes.
So when it comes to business investment or tourism or people building houses and that sort of thing, we would actually be in a good place. But my argument to that is that there's nothing stopping the councils doing that right now. They could work together, they could streamline their processes, they could actually integrate more and maybe share the work across them if they wanted to. So they could act like a unitary council if they wanted to now. But yeah, the costs versus the savings, and the traded off against what I see as a loss of local democracy with less councillors and less representation. I think we need to be focusing more on local solutions for people rather than large bureaucratic centralised structures.
Yeah, sure. You're talking about the costs, and that is costs that would obviously come back in rates and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So the savings were things like supposedly we're going to save money on IT systems and on some staff costs, but the cost of integrating those councils was also potentially quite a lot as well. So if you're spending as much money to do the project as you are going to save from it, then it's not it's not a compelling case on its own to say we should do it just for cost's sake.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of infrastructure, what would your plans or the Greens' plans be to help improve transport links between Wairarapa and Wellington and Pumps North and everywhere else?
Yeah, it's really important as a regional sort of powerhouse. We have to have connections to Palmerston North, to Wellington, to other parts of the country, both to get people in and our freight as well for our produce. So the Greens are pretty committed to rail, and one of the things we'd actually do is bring back some fairness into the funding process. So at the moment, road, rail and sea are all funded out of different buckets from government. Now, those projects don't get accurately compared or fairly compared to each other. So what we would do is actually bring those three funding pools together so that when there's an option for a road or railway or sea freight or any other sort of transport network improvement, you look at it in the context of the whole network and you say, well, what's the best project in terms of economics and social outcomes? And that allows you to say, well, this road might be actually not as good a deal as this railway link because you can compare them side by side. And at the moment, that can't happen because of the way they're funded. So I think it's a pretty fundamental one. And it would give local transport authorities a lot more flexibility in actually delivering a cohesive sort of plan rather than just little bits here and there.
And you would you advocate for, say, an improved a train like that has like more services between here and the capital?
Absolutely. I mean, I think our rail link to Wellington is probably the single most important bit of transport infrastructure we have, and it would be, it really needs to be upgraded. We need more services. We need better services, and if you're trying to encourage people to come and live from Wellington and the Wairarapa or live here and commute either way, if the trains aren't working, then they're not going to come. It's really as simple as that.
Absolutely. And to sort of wrap it up, like, you've got two beautiful daughters. What's your sort of dream for them, for the Wairarapa? Like, what would you want the Wairarapa to look like for their future?
Well, it's a good question because they're kind of the reason why I'm doing this whole thing. That was why I got into politics, to make change. So for me, I want to see the Wairarapa as a place where they grow up safe and happy, and their friends are all safe and happy as well. But more than that, they have options. They have options in terms of jobs, they have options in terms of where they live, and they live in a thriving region that has a really strong local food economy that's resilient to climate change, has good social services, and it's just that idea that it takes a village to raise a child. I want Wairarapa to be the village they grow up in, that they want to stay here because it's such a neat place.
Excellent. Anything you'd like, finally, you'd like to add?
I just say one final push that Labour needs a strong partner. It's one thing to talk about climate change and clean rivers and inequality, but it's another to have the policies and the people to follow through with it. So if you want to give Labour a strong support partner, you need to party vote Green. That's what I'd ask for.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. That's great.
Thank you.